Howdy, partners. This is Mark L. Redmond, Western author, and I'm back here for part 6 of my first chapter series. If you haven't seen the first 5, I encourage you to watch them. Go to my YouTube channel, subscribe if you haven't already. The Adventures of Arty Anderson is a middle grade series that I wrote a while back. It's set in post-Civil War Texas. Takes place in the 1870s. Centers around young Arty Anderson and his mother, who moved from Ohio to Texas in the first book, Arty Goes West, to take over a ranch that Arty's father bought shortly before his father died in a fire. But Arty and his mom decided to go ahead and take over the ranch anyway, and they make a lot of new friends, have some really great ranch hands. Arty makes new friends, and goes through all the series I call The Adventures of Arty Anderson because he really does go through a lot of adventures, all kinds of things. But he's not a whole lot different from some of the kids that run around us today. Human nature's the same was the same back then as it is now. Today we're going to look at the final book in the Arty Anderson series. This particular one is Arty's Tough Trail. A little bit of background. This was illustrated by David Miles, a good friend of mine from South Bend, Indiana. Attended the same church that I attended when I lived there. The artist who did the work in books 2, 3, 4, and 5 of the series is Laura Urey, who taught art at our Christian school while I was teaching English. Also a very good friend. And did a great job on illustrating these books so the Sword of the Lord could publish them. Let's take a look at chapter 1 of Arty's Tough Trail. Of this one, my editor used to ask me questions frequently. He would either send me a letter, back then we had a lot of snail mail, or an email on some of the newer books, and ask me, okay, could this happen? And on this particular book, there's a point where a calf gets, or a young cow gets stuck on a cattle drive, gets stuck crossing a river in the river mud, the mud at the bottom of the river. And in order to get him out, they needed 4 or 5 cowboys. They couldn't just put a rope around his neck and pull him out. And my editor said, "Is that true?" And it kind of hurt my feelings. I had to say to him, if it weren't true, it wouldn't be in the book, because I do try to make everything, even though Arty and his cohorts are all made up. White Rock, the town, is made up. The Circle A, their ranch, is made up. Texas is real, and the historical part is as accurate as I can get it, because I care about my readers. I want them to find accuracy in my books. So I do everything I can. I've traveled all over. In fact, I'm talking to you from my study in Apache Junction, Arizona. We moved, my wife Susie and I moved to Arizona a couple years ago, and boy, do I get lots of material for Westerns now. In fact, the next series that I've already written the first book in it, again, it's the same time period, post-Civil War Texas, but it's set in Arizona territory. I think you might find it enjoyable too. Watch for it. I'm waiting for a cover for it. The people who design my covers are working on it, and once I get the cover, I'll get the book published and probably let you know what it looks like, and we'll do first chapter on it anyway as well. Okay, Arty's Tough Trail. Chapter 1. Let me put my cheaters on here. You'd be up at 4 each morning, Bill told me. Yes, sir, I replied. In the saddle at least 16 hours a day, he added. Yes, sir, I replied. You'd sleep on the ground at night and ride night herd when it came your turn, he said. Bill looked as serious as I've ever seen him look, but I was grinning. I don't reckon I could have stopped grinning if I'd tried. Yes, sir, I replied. Every opening in your head would be filled with dust most of the time, he said. Yes, sir, I said. You'd have sand in most of your food, and you'd stay in the saddle regardless of the weather, Bill said. He rubbed his bearded chin and then the back of his thick, powerful neck. Sitting on the ranch house steps beside me, he stared straight ahead. Yes, sir, I replied. You'd be far away from the ranch and your ma and grandparents for 2 or 3 months. Yes, sir, I replied. You still want to go? He looked at me for the first time since he'd sat down beside me. Yes, sir, I replied. Then my grin faded. Something wrong? Asked Bill. Ma will never agree to let me go, I said. I jumped up, stepped to the ground, and turned to face Bill. You could talk her into letting me go. She'd listen to you. Can't, said Bill, looking at me dejectedly. Can't, I said, my voice rising. What do you mean? Ma respects you. She trusts you. If you explained... Can't, Bill repeated. I jerked my hat from my head and slapped my leg with it. A small cloud of dust flew off my pants and blew away. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. What's wrong with you? There's not even a chance I'll get to go if you don't at least try to talk to Ma. Talk to me about what? Asked Ma. She had stepped from the ranch house and now stood behind Bill, smiling at me. Now, Ma was always pretty, but when she smiled, she was just plain beautiful. I already told Bill you could go on the cattle drive. He asked me yesterday. I really don't like it, but I reckon I have to let you learn to run this place. When I lowered my gaze to Bill, he was grinning. Can't, huh? Well, boss, said Bill, I didn't get a chance to tell you. We all laughed. Bill and Ma laughed because Bill had fooled me, but I laughed because I was going on a cattle drive. I had no idea how many reasons there were for not laughing. I'd learn about those later. I reckon winter was just about over. Some snow still hung on to the distant mountains, but the sun was shining brightly, and the bees buzzed around the early flowers. Birds were singing as I rode to the Travis Ranch. I had to share my exciting news with Esther. Like Ma, Esther was beautiful on the outside, and she was beautiful on the inside too. Also, like Ma, Esther brought out the best in me. She made me want to do what was right, not only because it was right, but also because it would please her. I couldn't explain to anyone else why she affected me the way she did. I didn't understand it myself. You're really going on a cattle drive? She asked. We sat at the kitchen table, sipping good hot coffee from china cups. We're sending 100 head with the herd. I wish I could go too. I really am going, I replied, trying not to grin. A cattle drive is no place for a woman, but don't you fret. I'll take good care of your cattle and make sure they get to Dodge City, or Ellsworth, or Abilene, to the end of the trail. I could feel myself blushing as Esther smiled. You don't really know where you're going yet, do you, cowboy? She chuckled. I don't reckon I do, I said. Since I'll likely be riding drag most of the time, I don't reckon I'll need to know where we're going. I'll be like the children of Israel in the desert, only instead of following a pillar of cloud, I'll be following the biggest cloud of dust I've ever seen, or breathed, or tasted, according to the hands who've ridden drag. I'm hoping we take the herd to Dodge City. When will you leave? Asked Esther. When we're done with the roundup, I reckon, I replied. I stood up, picked up my Stetson. Speaking of the roundup, I said, I'd best be going. There's work to be done, and I'm burning daylight. I'll see you again before we leave. By the time I got back to the ranch, I was hungry. I took my saddle off Prince and gave him some grain and turned him loose in the corral. Grandma and Ma were setting the table for our noon meal when I walked into the ranch house. Grandpa was drying his hands on a towel. All three smiled at me. Well, said Grandpa, therefore art thou, Romeo, and just in time to dine. For the second time that morning I felt my face turning red. I hung up my hat and my gun belt before washing my hands. When we were all seated at the table, Grandpa thanked God for the food, and we began to eat. After a few minutes of silence, Ma set her cup on its saucer and smiled at me. You're going to be mighty busy for the next 3 weeks, young man, she said. I swallowed a mouthful of Grandma's freshly baked bread and sipped my coffee. Why? I asked. Bill said the roundup wouldn't start for 2 weeks. True, Ma replied. But you can't just drop your schoolwork and ride off into the sunset. Miss Ross says if you work hard for the next 3 weeks, you can finish the work that she'll be teaching the others in your group after you leave. I felt a knot begin to form in my stomach. Ma, Bill said the roundup would start in 2 weeks. What about the first week of the roundup? Ma finished chewing a bite of beef, wiped her lips with her cloth napkin, and replied softly, Bill says there will be plenty of strays left when you join the other cowboys. You won't miss much. I knew that Grandma, Grandpa, and Ma were all watching to see how I took that news. I reckoned that up in heaven, Pa was watching too. Down deep inside, I was angry. If I said what I wanted to say right then, I would disappoint the people I loved most, and I would most likely wind up in trouble. I would have to apologize to my family. I needed time to think before I spoke. Cutting off the biggest piece of steak that I reckoned good manners would allow, I put it into my mouth. No one spoke while I chewed and thought. I swallowed, took a long drink of coffee, and then leaned back in my chair. I reckon Bill's right, Ma, I managed. I'm obliged to you for taking care of things with Miss Ross for me. I'll get my schoolwork done first, and then I'll get after those strays. All three of them looked relieved, I thought. I heard them sigh, as if they had been holding their breath while they waited for my reply to Ma. Grandpa spoke first. That was answered like a man, Arty, he said, and I'm proud of you. Thanks, Grandpa, I said. I felt good, but then I noticed Ma was blinking back tears. What's wrong, Ma? I asked. Pushing back my chair, I stepped around the table and knelt beside her chair. Shaking her head slowly, she took my face in her hands and said softly, Nothing is wrong. I'm just proud of you. And I wish your father could see you now. She kissed my forehead, wiped her eyes with her napkin, and sighed. Now, my grown-up young man, she said, placing a hand on my shoulder, I'm going to tell you something you need to hear. This morning, Bill told me that if you threw a tantrum or pouted when I talked to you about missing the first week of the roundup, he wouldn't let you go. He said that a trail drive is no place for a spoiled brat. I didn't say anything to Ma as I hugged her, but to God I whispered, "Thank you." I got up and returned to my chair. Swallowing the lump in my throat, I said, "I think Pa can see me. Don't you?" And that's chapter 1 from Arty Stuff Trail. And he is getting ready to have the experience of a lifetime. A cattle drive was a rough experience for anybody, but for someone his age, just starting out, it was an adventure for sure. There were a lot of exciting things, but it was also a very difficult time, as you'll find out if you read the book. And again, I hope you'll read it. I hope you'll enjoy it. Again, stop by marklredmond.com. Join my posse if you haven't already. You'll get all kinds of information about my writing, our life out here, some about when I was your age and growing up if you're still a kid, things that are going on in our lives now, all kinds of stuff. I'll try to keep you entertained and interested as well. Thank you for stopping by and listening to the reading from this book. I'll have more first chapters coming up from a different series and from a book of short stories as well, and more than likely from the first book in my new series, which hasn't even been published yet. Thanks for your time. Happy trails, folks. Talk to you later.